Welcome back to Feminism Theory and Practice. In the last lecture, we explored socialist feminism and its argument that you cannot separate gender oppression from economic exploitation. We met thinkers like Sylvia Federici and Nancy Fraser who showed how capitalism depends on women's unpaid labor. Today, we are tackling what might be the most discussed, most misunderstood, and most contested concept in contemporary feminism: intersectionality. You have probably heard this word, it's everywhere now. Politicians invoke it, critics attack it, social media fights about daily. But here's the thing, most people who use the term don't actually know where it came from or what is originally meant. So today we are going back to the source. We'll learn about the legal scholar who coined the term. We'll understand the specific problem she was trying to solve. And we'll trace the intellectual tradition that made her insight possible. The core question guiding this lecture is simple. What happens when different forms of oppression don't just add up but intersect? This question emerges from a concrete problem. Legal and policy frameworks are usually designed to see discrimination along a single axis: race or gender, caste or class, but lived experiences are not organized so neatly. When institutions are structured to recognize only one form of discrimination at a time, certain experiences fall completely out of view. It was black feminist thinkers who first developed the frameworks to explain how multiple systems of oppressions interlock, producing experiences that cannot be reduced to any single category. We'll also ask hard question. Has intersectionality been watered down? Has it been co-opted? Do the critiques from both left and right have merit? And as always, we'll bring it home to India, where the intersection of caste, class, and gender creates its own unique dynamics. Let's begin. The term intersectionality was coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal scholar and professor at UCLA and Columbia Law School. Crenshaw did not invent the term as a general theory of identity. She coined it to solve a very specific legal problem: the systematic invisibility of black women's experiences of discrimination in anti discrimination law. To understand what she meant, we need to closely look at a court case. In 1976, a group of black women sued General Motors. The lead plaintiff was Emma DeGraffenreid. Their complaint was straightforward. GM had discriminated against black women in its hiring and promotion practices. The company's last hired, first fired seniority system meant that when layoffs came in the mid 1970s, black women were disproportionately let go. Here's the crucial context. GM had not hired any black women before 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was passed. So when layoffs hit in 1973-75, all the black women who had been hired after 1970 lost their jobs. Seems like a clear case of discrimination, right? The court disagreed. The judge wrote, plaintiffs have failed to cite any decisions which have stated that black women are a special class to be protected from discrimination. The court's logic went like this: you can sue for race discrimination, you can sue for sex discrimination, but you cannot combine them to create a new super remedy. The court warned against opening a Pandora's box of new protected categories. And here's where it gets perverse. GM had hired black men in its factory jobs, so there was no racial discrimination, the court said. GM had hired white women in its secretarial and administrative positions. So there was no sex discrimination, the court said. Therefore, no discrimination at all. Do you see the problem? Black women's experience simply could not be seen. The legal framework was like a camera that could only photograph in black and white, and when the reality was in color. The intersection of race and gender created a specific form of exclusion that neither category alone could capture. This is where Crenshaw's metaphor comes in. She wrote, consider an analogy to traffic in intersection, coming and going in all four directions. Discrimination like traffic through an intersection may flow in one direction and it may flow in another. If an accident happens in an intersection, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions and sometimes from all of them. If you're standing in the intersection, you might get hit by a car coming from north or from east, or by the cars from multiple directions at once. And the injuries from being hit by multiple cars aren't just the sum of individual impacts, they create something qualitatively different. This is the key insight. Intersectionality is not about adding up operations. It's not black plus woman is equal to double oppression. It's about recognizing that the intersection creates an experience that cannot be understood by examining either road separately. Black woman's experience is not black experience plus woman's experience. It's something distinct that emerges at the intersection. In 1991, Crenshaw expanded her framework in an article called Mapping the Margins. She distinguished between two types of intersectionality: structural intersectionality and political intersectionality. Structural intersectionality refers to how women of color are positioned within overlapping structures of subordination. A battered woman of color doesn't just face domestic violence, she may also face poverty, lack of job skills, racial discrimination in housing, high unemployment in her community. Each burden compounds the other. Crenshaw documented how immigrant women were trapped in abusive marriages by immigration law. The marriage fraud amendments required immigrants to stay properly married for 2 years before applying for permanent residency. This forced women to choose between abuse and deportation. Political intersectionality describes how women of color are situated within at least two subordinated groups that often pursue conflicting agendas. Anti-racist movements sometimes suppress discussion of domestic violence to avoid reinforcing racist stereotypes. Feminist movements sometimes center white women's experience and ignore race. As Crenshaw put it, the need to split one's political energies between the two sometimes opposing political agendas is a dimension of intersectional disempowerment that men of color and white women seldom confront. You are caught in the middle, expected to choose sides in struggles that both claim to represent you but neither fully includes you. Now, Crenshaw coined the term, but the insight that race, gender, and class interlock to create distinct experiences didn't begin with her. Black feminist thinker had been articulating this for generations. Let me introduce you to four crucial texts and thinkers. The Combi River Collective was a black feminist lesbian socialist organization active in Boston from 1974 to 1980. The name honored Harriet Tubman's 1863 raid that freed over 750 enslaved people. Core members included Barbara Smith, Beverly Smith, and Demita Frazier. In 1977, they issued a statement that would become foundational to intersectional thought. They wrote, we are actively committed to struggling against race, racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and see as our particular task the development of integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. Interlocking. That's the key word. Not parallel, not separate, interlocking, like links in a chain. They also coined the term identity politics, but their meaning was very different from how the term is used today. They wrote, this focusing upon our own operation is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. Barbara Smith clarified in 2021 this meant black women have right to create a political agenda based on our intersecting identities. It was a claim to political agency, not the divisive tribalism the term often connotes today. And then they made a revolutionary claim. If black women were free, it would mean that everyone else have to be free since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. Think about that. If you center the most marginalized, if you address the intersection where multiple operations meet, you don't create a narrow politics, you create a universal liberation. Audre Lorde was a self described black lesbian mother warrior poet. In 1979, she delivered a speech at NYU's Second Sex Conference that would become legendary. She was one of the only two black women at a conference attended by over 800 women and the only openly lesbian speaker. She opened by noting this profound absence. I stand here as a black feminist, a lesbian feminist, having been invited to comment within the only panel at this conference where the input of black feminists and lesbian is represented. What this says about the vision of this conference is sad. In a country where racism, sexism, and homophobia are inseparable, her central critique targeted white feminism's refusal to engage with difference. The master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. What did she mean? A feminism that used the same exclusionary tactics of patriarchy that centers one group while marginalizing other cannot achieve true liberation. It will only rearrange who sits at the top of the hierarchy. Lord also introduced the concept of the mythical norm. Somewhere on the edge of consciousness, there is what I call a mythical norm, which each one of us within our hearts know that it's not me. In America, this norm is usually defined as white, thin, male, young, heterosexual, Christian, and financially secure. Everyone who deviates from this norm is marked as different, and those who deviate in multiple ways face compounded exclusion. Bell Hooks, who spelled her name in lowercase as a political statement, published Feminist Theory from Margin to Center in 1984. Her target was Betty Friedan's The Feminist Feminine Mystique, the book that launched second wave feminism. Hooks pointed out that Friedan's famous problem that has no name referred only to the plight of a select group of college educated middle and upper class married white women, housewives bored with leisure, with home, with children, with buying products who wanted more out of life. Hooks asked a pointed question. She did not discuss who would be called in to take care of the children and maintain the home if more women like herself were freed from their house labor. The answer, of course, was other women, black women, poor women, working class women. Friedan's liberation required someone else's continued subordination. But Hooks didn't just critique, she offered an alternative. She reconceptualized marginality as an epistemological advantage. Living as we did on the edge, we developed a particular way of seeing reality. We looked both from the outside in and from the inside out. We focused our attention on the center as well as the margin. We understood both. Those at the margin can see the whole system, those at the center only see themselves. Patricia Hill Collins provided the most systematic theoretical framework in her 1990 book, Black Feminist Thought. She introduced the concept of the matrix of domination, which she defined as the overall social organization within which intersecting operations originate, develop, and are contained. Collins distinguished this from intersectionality itself. Intersectionality describes a specific social location using mutually constructing features of operation. The matrix of domination describes the overall organization of power in society. A crucial insight: there are few pure victims or oppressors in the matrix. A white working class man may be privileged by race and gender but oppressed by class. A wealthy black woman may be privileged by class but oppressed by race and gender. We all occupy complex positions. Collins identified four domains of power: the structural domain, which includes law, economy, and politics; the disciplinary domain of bureaucratic management and surveillance; the hegemonic domain of ideology and culture; and the interpersonal domain of everyday interactions. Real change requires addressing all four. You can change laws, but if ideology remains unchanged, the laws will be undermined. You can shift culture, but if structures remain, people will be constrained regardless of their belief. Intersectionality has faced sustained criticism from multiple directions. Let's engage with these critiques seriously. Some Marxist critics argue that intersectionality fragments the working class and undermines solidarity. Adolf Reed Jr. has been particularly sharp. He argues that intersectionality functions as a species of ethnic interest group establishment politics that represents detente with rather than commitment to changing capitalist class relations. His critique by emphasizing race and gender identities, intersectionality obscures class differentiation. A wealthy black woman and a poor black woman have very different interests, but focusing on their shared racial identity can mask this. Barbara and Karen Fields make a related argument in their book Racecraft. They contend that race is not an idea but an ideology that obscures actual class based economic exploitation. Racial categories are in real in their effect but not in their essence. They emerge from particular historical processes of exploitation, not from biology. The core left critique, intersectionality, promotes identity politics that fracture working class unity and creates competing claims to victimhood rather than unified class consciousness. Conservative critics offer different objections. Some argue that intersectionality creates a hierarchy of victimhood, where your moral authority depends on how many marginalized identities you can claim. This incentivizes grievance rather than accomplishment. Others argue that intersectionality's logical conclusion is actually individualism. Jordan Peterson has claimed there's so many different ways of categorizing people's advantages and disadvantages that if you take that all the way out to end, you say, well, the individual is the ultimate minority. The implication, if everyone's intersection is unique, then group based analysis becomes meaningless and we should just treat people as individuals. Critics also argue that intersectionality is unfalsifiable. Any outcome can be explained by some intersection of identities. It becomes a theory that explains everything and therefore explains nothing. Perhaps the most interesting critique come from within the academy itself. Jennifer Nash, Black Feminism Reimagined, argues that Black feminism has become marked by a single effect: defensiveness, manifested by efforts to police intersectionality's usages and circulation. She identifies intersectionality wars and critiques what she calls proprietary impulses around the concept. Serge Bilch warns of neoliberal co-optation, a specifically disciplinary academic feminism in tune with the neoliberal knowledge economic engages in argumentative practice that reframe and undermine intersectionality, confining it to an academic exercise of meta theoretical contemplation. In other words, intersectionality gets stripped of its radical content and becomes a diversity buzzword, a box to check, a way of instructions to signal virtue without changing structures. Crenshaw herself acknowledges this risk. The other issue is that intersectionality can get used as a blanket term to mean, well, it's complicated. Sometimes it's complicated is an excuse not to do anything. How might defenders of intersectionality respond? To the left critique, Crenshaw's original formulation was explicitly structural. It emerged from critical legal studies and analyzed how institutions produce discrimination. The point was never to fragment the working class, but to recognize that a working class movement that ignores race and gender will fail to mobilize many workers. The Combi River Collective was explicitly socialist. To the right critique, intersectionality isn't just about creating hierarchies of victimhood. It is about understanding how systems of power actually operate. And the individual is the ultimate minority argument misses the point. Intersectionality analyzes how social structures position people, not how unique each person feels. To academic critique, this is the most troubling because it's largely correct. Intersectionality has been diluted. But that's an argument for recovering its radical roots, not abandoning it. Crenshaw's own response to critiques. There's nothing new about defenders of the status quo criticizing those who are demanding that injustices can be addressed. It is all a crisis over a sense that things might actually have to change for equality to be real. Now, let's bring this to India. Because if intersectionality means anything, it means attending to specific forms that interlocking oppression takes in different contexts. And in India, that means talking about caste. Indian scholars have argued that caste and gender are interlocking systems, producing specific experiences at their intersection. Uma Chakravarti's concept of Brahminical patriarchy argues that caste based marriage and control over women's sexuality are crucial for the caste system's continuation. Caste is reproduced through endogamy, marriage within caste, and endogamy requires control over women's body and choices. This means caste determines not just the division of labor but sexual division of labor and what might be called the division of sexual labor. Upper caste men historically had access to lower caste women's bodies. The reverse was never permitted. Dalit feminists have critiqued mainstream Indian feminism for centering upper caste women's experiences. Sharmila Rege called this the masculinization of Dalithood and sovereignization of womanhood. Both Dalit movements and feminist movements marginalize Dalit women. The slogan, All women are Dalits, exemplified this problem. It tried to create solidarity by universalizing the Dalit experiences but ending up erasing actual Dalit women. If all women are metaphorically Dalits, then the specific oppression of real Dalit women disappears. Sharmila Rege, a professor of sociology at the University of Pune who died in 2013, was the foremost theorist of Dalit feminist standpoint. In her foundational 1998 article, Dalit Women Talk Differently, Rege argued that non Dalit feminists cannot speak as or speak for Dalit women, but they can reinvent themselves as Dalit feminists through a transformation from their cause to our cause. This wasn't about biological identity, it was about political commitment. Upper caste women could become Dalit feminists by centering Dalit women's experiences and struggle in their analysis and action. Regi drew heavily on B.R. Ambedkar's analysis. Caste determines the division of labor, sexual division of labor, and division of sexual labor. She identified multiple patriarchies resulting from both Brahminical conspiracy and the relationship of different caste groups to the means of production. Upper caste women were more likely to face dowry deaths and family violence within the domestic sphere. Dalit women were more likely to face collective and public threat of rape, sexual assault, physical violence at the workplace and in public. Different patriarchies, different vulnerabilities, but connected systems. Let me give you some concrete examples of caste, class, gender intersection. Manual scavenging. Of the estimated 1.2 to 1.3 million manual scavengers in India, 99% are Dalits and 95% are women. Women clean private dry toilets and carry excreta in baskets. The practice passes through marriage. Young brides work along with their mother-in-laws. Despite being banned in since 1993, no single conviction occurred in 20 years under the Prohibition Act. The Devdasi system. Young girls from lower caste are married to temple deities, performing temple duties and sexual services. Current estimates suggest 450,000 Devdasis in India, practiced overwhelmingly among scheduled caste. As scholar Maria Con- Constanza Tori explains, the social control and hegemonic masculinity of upper caste men is asserted and maintained through defilement and appropriation of lower caste women's sexuality. The Bhanwari Devi case. In 1992, Bhanwari Devi, a lower caste social worker who tried to stop a child marriage in an upper caste family, was gang raped by five men in retaliation. The trial court acquitted the accused with infamous reasoning. Men of higher caste cannot rape a lower caste woman because that would be considered impure. The caste logic overrode even the most basic recognition of sexual violence. The case eventually led to Vishaka guidelines on workplace sexual harassment, but Banwari Devi herself remains outside their scope. After more than 30 years, justice remains denied. Some Indian scholars question whether intersectionality is necessary when India has its own traditions of understanding multiple operations. Nivedita Menon points out that Ram Manohar Lohia in mid 20th century India already linked caste, class, gender, and language politics. She asked pointedly, even when an understanding of politics in the global south predates a name for a similar understanding developed in the Western academy, it is the earlier conception that will named after the later. This is a valid concern. We shouldn't import frameworks uncritically just because they come from American universities. But Mary E. Jones responds that intersectionality remains valuable. If used reflexively, it can serve as an excellent candidate for critical dialogue across global feminist margins and centers. The concept travels, but it must be reworked for each context. The National Federation of Dalit Women captured Dalit women's position. They are Dalit among Dalits because they are thrice alienated on the basis of caste, class, and gender. Whether you call it intersectionality or something else, that experience demands analysis. So, what have we learned today? Intersectionality began as a legal argument. Kimberly Crenshaw invented a term to solve a specific problem, the invisibility of black women's discrimination in anti discrimination law. The D. Griffin Reid case showed that a framework that can only see race or gender will miss discrimination that operates at intersection of both. But Crenshaw was building on a rich tradition of black feminist thought. The Combi River Collective articulated interlocking operations. Audre Lorde challenged the master's tool. Bell Hooks centered the margin. Patricia Hill Collins systemized the matrix of domination. The framework has faced serious critiques from the left for fragmenting class solidarity, from the right for promoting victimhood, from within the academy for being diluted and co opted. Some of these critics have merit. Intersectionality has often been reduced to a buzzword, a diversity checkbox, an excuse for complexity without action. In India, the intersection of caste, class, and gender creates specific dynamics. Dalit feminist thinkers like Sharmila Rege have developed their own frameworks that both draw on and depart from American intersectionality. The experience of Manuel Scavengers, Devdasis, and women like Banwari Devi cannot be understood through any lens. Let me leave with you four key points. First, intersectionality is not about adding up oppression, it's about recognizing that the intersection creates qualitatively distinct experiences that cannot be understood by examining any single axis alone. Second, the concept has a specific intellectual genealogy in black feminist thought. Understanding this history help us to use the framework more precisely and resist its dilution. Third, critiques from left and right both have merit and must be engaged seriously. But the solution is not to abandon the framework but to recover its radical structural core. Fourth, in India, caste transforms everything. Any feminism that doesn't grapple with caste is incomplete. Dalit feminist scholars have developed their own frameworks that must be central to how we think about gender in Indian context. In the next lecture, we're going to take another step outward. We have talked about how race and class intersect with gender within countries. But what about the global level? What happens when Western feminism travels to the rest of the world? Next time, post colonial feminism. We'll meet thinkers like Chandra Mohanty, Gayatri Spivak, and Uma Narayan, who asked uncomfortable questions about how Western feminism represent, speaks for, and sometimes dominate women in the global south. Can the subaltern speak? And who gets to speak for whom? If this is helping you to think more clearly about gender and power, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Leave a comment. I want to hear what's resonating and what's you are questioning. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.